Have you ever considered what it means that the Appalachian Mountains have been burying people every winter for longer than any written record exists, and that the explanation given has almost always been the same? The cold, the ice, the exposure, the bad luck of a traveler caught between shelters. These are the official answers, the ones that appear in sheriff's records and newspaper reports, and in the statistical data that academic researchers compile when they study disappearances in remote terrain. They are not wrong answers. Exactly. People do die of cold in those mountains. People do get lost in whiteout conditions and stumble off trail edges in the dark. The explanation is real. The problem is that the explanation is not sufficient. The numbers have never been sufficiently explained by cold alone. The patterns have never quite matched what the weather would produce. And there is one group of people in the southern Appalachians who have been watching those numbers and those patterns for long enough that they have a different explanation. One that they have not, for the most part, offered to the wider world, because the wider world has given them no reason to believe it would be received with the seriousness it deserves. Drop your location in the comments right now. I want to know where you are, and more specifically, I want to know how close you are to the mountains tonight, because what I am about to share was told to me by a man who has spent 40 years studying the relationship between the Cherokee oral tradition and the documented disappearance record in the southern Appalachians. And what he believes the mountains bury every winter is not what the weather reports say it is. His name was Dr. Walter Amonsequat. He died in 2022 at the age of 74, and with his permission, I recorded his account in full in 2019. He was a member of the Eastern Band of the Cherokee and held a doctorate in anthropology from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, which he had spent 37 years applying to the study of Cherokee oral tradition in a way that took both the academic and the traditional frameworks seriously, without reducing either one to a tool for the other. He was a patient man and a careful one, and he had spent enough of his career having his work treated as anthropologically interesting but epistemically unserious, that he had developed a precise and slightly exhausted way of explaining himself to people who came to him with good intentions and embedded assumptions. I tried to come with fewer assumptions than most. He was willing to accept that as a starting point. The winter disappearances are not a modern phenomenon, Amonsequat explained. They are not a consequence of increased recreational use of the backcountry or of the cellular dead zones, or of the particular ecosystem disruption that has changed the behavior of wildlife in the southern Appalachians since the mid-20th century. The Cherokee oral tradition contains accounts of winter disappearances in these mountains from periods that predate European contact, and those accounts do not treat the winter itself as the agent. The winter, in the tradition's understanding, is a condition. It is the condition under which something else operates more freely, something that the oral tradition documents as specifically and particularly active in the deep winter months, from the last frost of November through the first thaw of early March, and considerably less active in the warmer months when the human world and the world above and below it are, in the traditional understanding, in a different kind of relationship. He was careful to contextualize this within the broader Cherokee cosmology, which I will summarize as accurately as I can from his explanation. The Cherokee traditional worldview does not separate the natural world from the spiritual world in the way that European-derived frameworks tend to. These are not two separate domains with a permeable barrier between them. They are the same domain viewed from different positions or at different times. What changes between summer and winter is not the presence or absence of spiritual entities in the landscape, they are always present, but rather the quality of their activity and the degree to which that activity intersects with the human world. Winter, in this framework, is a season of reduced human mobility and increased non-human activity in both the ecological and the spiritual sense. The bears are in their dens, and the non-human intelligences of the landscape are less constrained by the presence and movement of people. The specific winter entity that the oral tradition most consistently associates with human disappearances, Amonsequat described using the Cherokee name, and then, carefully, offered an English description that he cautioned was approximate: the mountain keeper, in the sense of something that maintains an accounting of what enters the mountain in winter and does not always permit what entered to leave. He was specific that this was not a predator in any simple sense. He was specific that the tradition did not frame it as malevolent in the way that a human might be malevolent, with intent and preference and the satisfaction of harm. It operated, in the traditional understanding, according to its own logic, which was not a human logic, and the most consistent description of its activity was that it collected, not selectively in the way a hunter selects prey, but periodically in the way a tide collects what the sea brings in. The oral accounts that Amonsequat had documented over his career described the process in consistent terms. The affected person does not disappear suddenly. The disappearance has a preceding period, sometimes several days, sometimes a week or more, during which the person displays behaviors that the tradition has a specific vocabulary for. They become drawn toward the higher elevations rather than the lower ones, which in winter is the opposite of instinct and the opposite of survival logic. They show an orientation toward north and toward the deeper interior of the mountain, away from trails, away from settlement. They describe, in accounts where they have spoken to others before the final disappearance, a sense of being called, not in any language, but in the way that hunger calls, in the way that thirst calls. A directional urgency that they cannot account for rationally, and then they go toward the interior, and they do not come back. Amonsequat had cross-referenced these traditional account descriptions against the documented disappearance cases in the National Park Service records for the Great Smoky Mountains, the Nantahala National Forest, and the Cherokee National Forest from 1934 through 2018, a period for which relatively consistent documentation existed. He was looking for cases in which there were witness accounts of the disappeared person's behavior in the days before the disappearance. He found 31 such cases. 22 of them contained behavioral descriptions that aligned with the traditional account pattern: unusual orientation toward higher elevations, comments about feeling drawn in a specific direction, behavioral changes consistent with disrupted rather than impaired cognition. 7 of the 31 subjects were never found. Of those 7, none were found in the spring thaw, which was statistically inconsistent with the geography and the documented temperature conditions. Bodies lost to cold and exposure in that terrain, under normal search parameters, are found when the snow melts, because the snow is what hid them. The 7 who were never found were, in Amonsequat's analysis, not simply lost. They had gone somewhere that the spring thaw did not reach. He told me about one case that he believed was the most complete illustration of the pattern. In January of 1987, a man named Edwin Couch, 53 years old, a retired schoolteacher from Asheville, was reported missing from a trail in the Smokies after a solo day hike. He was experienced, well-equipped for winter conditions, and was hiking a trail he had done many times before. His wife reported to the Park Service that Edwin had seemed different in the 3 days before the hike. Not unwell, not distressed, but what she described as elsewhere. She said he had been oriented toward the mountains in a specific way, looking at the distant ridgelines from their house, with an attention that was different from his normal appreciation of the view. She said he had told her, the evening before he left, that he felt as though there was something in the mountain range that was waiting for him, and that he wanted to see what it was. He said this without alarm, she reported. He said it the way you would say you wanted to see what was in the next room. Edwin Couch was never found. The search lasted 11 days and covered the relevant grid extensively. No remains, no equipment, no evidence of where he had left the trail. The Park Service case file lists the case as open. Amonsequat said he did not think Edwin Couch had suffered. He said the tradition was not clear on what happened to those who followed the calling to its end, but that it was clear on one thing. The mountain keeper did not cause suffering in the way a predator or a violent human caused suffering. What happened was more like the end of one thing and the beginning of another, in a register that human frameworks were not well equipped to describe. He said he found that distinction meaningful. He said he thought it was worth passing on. He also told me what the traditional protective practices were, the behaviors that, over long periods of careful observation, had been identified as most likely to prevent the winter drawing from affecting a particular individual. I am not going to describe those practices in detail, because they belong to the tradition, and Amonsequat shared them with me in a specific context that I want to respect. But the principle underlying all of them was consistent with what other elders had described in different contexts. The drawing worked through isolation. The individual who felt the pull of the interior, who became oriented toward the high ground and the deep cold, was an individual who had become, for reasons the tradition attributed to specific circumstances, temporarily disconnected from the web of human relationship and attention that normally anchored a person to the surface world. The protective practices were all, at their core, ways of restoring that connection. Do not be alone in the winter mountains. That is the simplified version. Do not be alone, and if you feel a drawing that is directional and persistent and cannot be explained by hunger or thirst or any ordinary need, turn around and go toward the nearest other person, and do not stop until you are with them. Amonsequat spent 3 years compiling the 22 behavioral pattern matches from the Park Service and Forest Service records before he felt the analysis was solid enough to share publicly. He had presented portions of it at 2 academic conferences, one on ethnoecology and one on Appalachian studies, and had received what he described as politely interested, but ultimately dismissive responses. The consistent objection was methodological. The behavioral data in the Park Service records was inconsistent in how it was collected, dependent on the quality of individual investigators' reports, and too subject to retrospective interpretation by surviving witnesses to be treated as reliable evidence of a pattern. He accepted those objections as legitimate in a limited sense. He believed the methodological concerns were being used as a reason not to engage with the substance of what the data showed, and he distinguished between those two things carefully, but without bitterness. He said the academic reflex to methodological critique as a substitute for substantive engagement was something he had stopped expecting to change, and had started simply working around. He returned to me after our first session with a printed copy of what he called his summary document, a 15-page analysis that presented the 22 behavioral matches in table form alongside the relevant traditional account descriptions, and a statistical analysis of the likelihood that the correlation was accidental. I am not a statistician, and I cannot evaluate the statistical methodology in technical terms. What I can say is that the summary document was the most carefully structured piece of scholarship I encountered in all my research into this subject, and that it deserved, and had not received, serious engagement. He also showed me something that was not in the published summary, a collection of what he called informal accounts, statements gathered not through official channels, but through personal contacts and community networks over 37 years of fieldwork. 29 statements, each one from a person who had personal experience relevant to the winter disappearance pattern. People who had felt the drawing themselves and had turned back. People who had accompanied search parties for missing winter hikers and had noticed something anomalous about the search conditions. People who had grown up in mountain communities where specific knowledge about winter behavior in the high country was maintained and passed down outside any official or academic system. He read me 3 of the informal accounts. The first was from a man who had been on a solo winter camping trip in the Nantahala wilderness in 1993, and who had, on the 3rd night, experienced what he described as a directional pull toward the high ground to the north that was strong enough to wake him from sleep. He said he lay in his sleeping bag for approximately an hour, fully awake, fully aware of the pull, aware that it was not hunger or thirst or any physical need he could name, and aware simultaneously that moving in the direction it indicated would take him away from the trail, away from the access road, and into terrain that he had no preparation for navigating at night in January. He said he pulled his sleeping bag more tightly around himself and did not move. By morning, the pull was gone. He said that in the 29 years since, he had told 4 people about that night, and that all 4 of them had immediately told him about their own similar experiences in winter backcountry, experiences they had also not spoken about, because there was no framework for them and no good outcome to describing them to people who would interpret them as evidence of stress or hypothermia or panic. He said it was, in retrospect, a relief to be in a room with someone who would write it down. The second informal account was from a woman who had been on a search team for a missing hiker in the Roan Highlands in February of 2004. The hiker was found after 6 days, alive, physically intact, but unable to account for 5 of the 6 days. He could remember the first day of his hike and approximately the first hour of the second. He could not account for the interval. He had been found sitting in a ravine 4 miles from his last known position, facing north, with his gear partially removed, in conditions that should have been fatal for exposure, but were not. He was oriented when found but could not explain how he had reached the ravine or what had occupied the 5 missing days. The woman from the search team said that among the team members, the discussion of those 5 days was brief and was not included in any official report. She said the team lead had specifically said to leave it out of the report, because there was nothing to report that would be of use to any future search effort. She said she had understood what he meant and had agreed with him and had not said anything about it in 15 years. The third account was from an elder in a mountain community in Mitchell County, North Carolina, who had been raised with specific knowledge of what the community called the winter rules. Not the Cherokee tradition specifically, but a parallel tradition that the community maintained in a Scots-Irish Presbyterian framework, different cosmological language, same behavioral content. Do not go alone into the high ground in deep winter. Do not respond to anything that calls from the direction of the ridge. Do not sleep facing north when on the mountain in January or February. If you feel drawn toward the interior when there is no physical reason for it, go downhill immediately and do not stop until you have crossed a running stream. The elder said these rules had been maintained in the community for as long as anyone could remember. She said she did not know their origin. She said that whether their origin was Cherokee or Scots-Irish or something older than either, the content of the rules was old enough that it deserved to be treated as information rather than superstition. Amonsequat had listened to that account with particular attention. He said afterward that the convergence between the Cherokee winter tradition and the mountain community's Scots-Irish tradition, different origins, different frameworks, same behavioral content, was the most compelling evidence he had found that both were documenting something real rather than constructing something cultural. When 2 independent systems of knowledge, developed in different contexts by different peoples with different cosmologies, arrive at the same practical conclusions, he said, the question of whether those conclusions are accurate deserves more serious consideration than the question of which framework is epistemically legitimate. Here is the question that has not left me since those conversations with Walter Amonsequat in 2019. He died 3 years after we spoke. He spent 40 years building a methodology that took both academic rigor and traditional knowledge seriously, and he produced a body of work that the academic community has largely treated as culturally interesting and epistemically inconclusive. The official explanation for winter disappearances in the southern Appalachians remains the one it has always been: cold, exposure, bad luck, difficult terrain. The numbers that do not fit that explanation, the 7 bodies never recovered, the 22 behavioral patterns that align with accounts the academic mainstream does not take seriously, remain in their respective categories, officially unconnected. Is that the correct conclusion, or is it the convenient one? What does it mean that the mountains bury, every winter, a number of people that the weather alone does not quite account for? And who has been watching long enough to have an answer? If you have known someone who disappeared in the winter mountains, or if you have experienced anything in winter backcountry that you have not been able to adequately explain, I want to hear from you in the comments. These accounts are not dismissed here. Subscribe if the truth of these mountains matters to you. Until next time, in winter, do not go alone into the high ground. And if you feel pulled toward the interior, stop where you are and call someone back into the world with you.